Well, we are heading now for some sort of showdown. I think there will be uh, both in military terms and also eventually in political and even geopolitical terms, some sort of major change. What kind of change that will be, I cannot say for sure, but things are clearly moving. The political landscape is changing, and the opinion polling data, which just was published, allegedly, reliable opinion polling data from Russia indicates that the support for the war has dramatically declined, and that if this development goes on, we may have also some domestic political repercussions from that. This would be nothing new. In earlier lost wars, the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire, they have then started reforms, as for instance after the Crimean War in the 19th century, or as a result also partly of the Afghanistan adventure of the Soviet Union, and the unsuccessfulness of this adventure. Then Gorbachev also started his reforms. So I'm not sure yet what the result of all of this will be, but I think the landscape, the political landscape, will change, and I think sooner rather than later. Some people say that this could go on for years and years, or even for 2 decades. I don't think so. I think it may go on for a couple of more years, but then we will probably see some change. No, there isn't, but that was also the case when the Soviet Union was breaking up. So there was also no big sort of alternative movement. It was rather an internal, and by internal I mean here a process internally to the regime, to the power structures, to the existing Soviet state, that then led to the deconstruction of the Soviet state, and then also of the Soviet system and the Soviet Union. So this is also, I think, something that will rather happen as something happening within the regime rather than from an outside force. Navalny is in prison, and civil society is suppressed. Many people, many activists are outside Russia. So I expect here to happen rather something within the regime. But I should also say that other experts, they are much more pessimistic. They don't think that any of this will actually lead to some sort of destabilization or major destabilization of this regime. There could be some sort of peaceful change of power. I wouldn't exclude that. The question would be, of course, what kind of new power this would then be. It's not just that the change will be peaceful, but whether this will actually lead to a substantive change. I think chances are that it will lead to a substantial change. It could be also a violent change of power. It could be even a revolution. If, for instance, social issues come more to the forefront, we may actually see something similar to 1917. Nothing of this, I think, can now be excluded, because the problems that Russia is having are accumulating. And as far as I get the signals from the West, the major Western countries are ready to support Ukraine, and they will not back down. And even Germany is now basically on board, and these calls for compromise and concessions that we had until February, they are now largely gone. That is difficult to say, because we don't know much about the internal workings of the regime, and we can only speculate what is happening inside. I mean, these guys are largely former KGB officers. They are professional, secret agents. They know how to keep secrets and how to keep that all sheltered from outside research. So it's difficult to say, but judging from from the domestic, not only from the foreign context, but now also from the domestic context, this is going to be very difficult, I think, for the regime. And so far, it looks as if the difficulties are becoming larger and larger, and Ukraine is not going to back down. And apparently, the West will support Ukraine. So the problems for the regimes are going to accumulate. My suspicion is that they are not very free to be active, for at least for the time being. And they are, of course, also under the spell of this propaganda that they, I suppose, consume every day in Russia as the Russians do. And some of the acts that we have seen, the sort of sabotage acts, perhaps even some of the assassinations may have been, I would guess if they have indeed been done by anti-regime forces, by Russians. My suspicion is just that Ukrainians would be too exposed anyway, and that they would be, watched by the services in Russia anyway. So they would have perhaps less freedom to actually do something inside Russia than ordinary Russians. And I suspect that there are actually Russians, just who have no connection to Ukraine, who are very unhappy with the regime and are ready to engage in sabotage, in perhaps even in terrorism. I would say like 3/4 of the things that have been done, have to be done, are military in their nature. It's all about military successes and for Ukraine, and defeats for Russia. Because these defeats have domestic repercussions. I could also imagine, I don't know what the tactics and strategies of the Ukrainian military command are, that it may sometimes actually make more sense to let's say, destroy the supply lines of the Russian troops in Ukraine rather than actually fighting these Russian troops, because that may actually generate then dissatisfaction on the side of the Russian soldiers, and then they could be even turned into some sort of domestic destabilization force, something like. But I don't think that is particularly original to say this, and I'm almost sure that thoughts like this are also on the minds of the Ukrainian generals and officers. What I would still see as a sort of potential here of Ukraine is to approach the international context with a little bit more fantasy and a little bit more sort of strategic thinking, rather than the emotional appeal for help, for solidarity, which is done very good. It's effective, and there's a lot of empathetic support. For instance, in Germany, which I know well, people are actually really interested and also emotionally involved with Ukraine. What is still missing is, I think, two things. First, a better clarification why this war and this conflict with Russia is actually important, not only for Ukraine, and is not only important of idealistic sort of values, European values, human values, something like that, but why it would be also important for the security and the future and the safety of, let's say, West Europeans. The argument that Ukrainians here often make is that, if we don't beat the Russians now, they will be tomorrow in Berlin. But I don't think this is, first, I don't think that is very realistic anyway. It's also an argument that does not fly very well. So most Germans, for instance, they think that this is a largely sort of something between Ukraine and Russia, and they don't think that this is necessarily something that concerns directly their own security. However, it does concern, of course, the security also of West Europeans, and one could even argue of the end of all people on Earth, because what Russia is doing, it's subverting the international security system, the UN system, the non-proliferation regime, international law as a regulating mechanism, the whole idea that international organizations and international law can preserve peace and protect small nations. That is the principle that is undermined now by Russia, and that is of course very dangerous because it may communicate to many countries around the world that they should arm themselves. They cannot rely on international law, they cannot rely on international organizations. They need the bomb, so to say, some sort of weapon of mass destruction to deter larger countries to attack them, or perhaps even like to do like Russia and use the threat of an employment of weapons of mass destruction to increase their territory. Something like that could be also imagined. And that if you know, this impression becomes widespread, then this could actually derail the whole international security system that we are used to. You know, we are used to a sort of more or less stable system where the UN, the OSCE, international law, they all play some sort of role in regulating conflicts between countries. But if this continues for long and if Russia is successful, then this system will be gone. And the second, and Ukrainians should talk sort of more intelligently about that, rather than simply saying, you know, Putin is Hitler, and if we don't beat him, he will come after you. That is not so effective, I think. The other thing that I think where Ukrainians could be more intelligent is to look for possible cooperation partners in the Russian diaspora, those who are on one page basically with Ukraine, who also want a Ukrainian victory, who are ready for reparations, who want the regime to fall, who basically are on Ukraine's side. And there are some. There are not many. Many of the Russians in the diaspora are ambivalent. Some of them are even pro-Putin. These are certainly not partners for Ukraine, but some of them are pretty radical in their sort of anti-imperial, pro-Ukrainian stance. If I think I understand that this is now emotionally very, very difficult for Ukrainians to have any sort of cooperation with Russians, but I think the same, by the way, goes for Belarusians. But strategically, I think that is eventually important because you know, we need other people in Russia, and Ukraine cannot change its geography, and so we need other politicians, other leaders in Russia and in Belarus, and with these potential for Ukraine acceptable leaders, there should be perhaps some sort of cooperation to work together. But I know that this is now probably a rather unpopular idea, and for many Ukrainians simply impossible to do. You know, that is a broad field. There are different minorities, so and they have a different meaning for the Russian state. These minorities within Russia. So, for instance, there is the Northern Caucasus, which is not regarded as being essentially Russian, even by many Russians. So, this is something that is perhaps not so much actually something to undermine Russia. And as you know, of course, the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, he's a pro-Putinist, anti-Ukrainian actor. So I'm not sure that there's that much potential with these minorities beyond the Northern Caucasus, because they usually have no majorities in even the titular nations in the ethnic region. So I wonder how much this is eventually going to be a factor in Russian domestic affairs. Although, you know, the Yakuts or the Tatars and so on could at one point mobilize nationally and become separatists, but I'm not sure. That is a very far shot. Well, as I already mentioned, there is a part of the Russian opposition which already acknowledges this responsibility, which is ready to pay reparations, which is particularly happy if um, Russian assets, especially, for instance, assets from the oligarchs, are confiscated, are then used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So a part of the more intelligent, I would say, Russian opposition is actually quite forthcoming on this. Yeah, it will be domestically, of course. There would first have to be an acknowledgement of the crimes, then acknowledgement of the responsibility, even guilt of the Russian nation, and then we will perhaps eventually also come to reparations and to some sort of new start in Russian-Ukrainian relations. Whether it will continue to exist is indeed, with every day that the war continues, the problems for the state will increase, and then indeed that we could be heading towards something similar to the breakup of the Soviet Union. I don't think there will be a total sort of devolvement of the current federation, so-called federation, but there could indeed be separatism, and there could be even civil war. All of this is becoming more and more likely the longer the war continues. The problem with this genocidal war is that it's sort of it's irrational. It doesn't help Russia to win the war. It's and that was, I think, difficult to predict, because it's something that that you would think is not in the interests of Russia, because it sort of mobilizes just everybody against Russia.